Henry Creighton was on his way out of the hospital when he saw two little girls sitting alone by the ICU doors, silent, still, and impossibly sad. For the first time in years, he stopped without knowing why, and didn't keep walking. Henry Creighton's day began like most others, on schedule, efficient, and fully under his control. He arrived at the central branch of his private medical clinic network dressed in a tailored navy suit, his dark brown hair neatly combed back and blue eyes scanning through emails on his phone before the automatic glass doors even fully opened. He was there for a strategic inspection, a meeting with the Board of Physicians, and to review final documents for the hospital's upcoming expansion. It was a high-value facility in the heart of the city, and like everything Henry owned, it reflected precision and success. His assistants trailed behind him, barely keeping up, as he moved through the halls with practiced authority. No one questioned his presence. He was the man behind the empire. After a long morning of meetings and a short lunch taken between calls, he decided to do something he rarely did, walk through the pediatric wing personally. He wasn't sure what compelled him to go that way, perhaps a fleeting instinct to ensure the branding was visually perfect, or maybe just the subtle guilt he never quite acknowledged. Either way, he turned down the corridor that led to the children's intensive care unit. It was quieter here, the lighting softer, voices gentler. Nurses moved with measured calm, parents spoke in hushed tones. And then he saw them. Two little girls sat alone outside the double doors marked ICU. They couldn't have been older than 6. Both had pale blonde hair, long and slightly messy, with matching light pink dresses and worn shoes. One of them hugged a white stuffed bear so tightly it looked like part of her. Their expressions weren't frightened, but filled with something heavier, grief without tears, as if they'd cried everything out already. What struck Henry most was that they were completely alone. No adult hovered nearby. No nurse stood watch. He slowed his steps, something inside him shifting uncomfortably. He approached them cautiously and knelt down so he wouldn't tower over them. "Hello," he said in a softer voice than usual, the one he hadn't used since he was a much younger man. "Are you two all right? Are you waiting for someone?" The girl with the bear looked up at him, her wide blue eyes piercingly familiar, though he couldn't place why. Her voice was quiet but steady when she answered, "Our sister is inside. In the ICU." Henry blinked, surprised by the composure in such a small child. Before he could ask another question, the second girl spoke. "She's very sick. And our mom, she's in another room. She got sick too." Her voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Henry hesitated, unsure how involved he should become, until the first girl added something that froze him completely. "You're our dad." For a moment, the hallway tilted. He couldn't have heard her right. What?" he asked carefully, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The girl clutched her bear tighter and said, "Our mom told us our dad owns these clinics. She said if we ever saw him, we'd know. And we saw you in the newspaper once. It's you." Henry stared at them, speechless. His chest tightened as something long buried tried to surface. "What's your mother's name?" he asked, his voice low. The answer came from both girls in unison, "Emily Brooks." It hit him like a punch to the ribs. Emily. The only woman who had ever made him feel like more than a machine. The woman he had walked away from 6 years ago, convinced that love was a distraction and ambition was safer. He had no idea she'd had children. He had no idea she had given birth to 3 girls. And now one of them, his daughter, was fighting for her life behind those doors. Henry stood slowly, heart pounding. For the first time in years, he didn't know what to do next. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He couldn't walk away. Not from them. Not now. Not ever again. Henry stood in stunned silence, his mind racing to keep up with what the 2 little girls had just told him. The hallway seemed to grow quieter, the sounds around him muffled by the rush of blood in his ears. He looked down at them again, now seeing not just children in distress, but the unmistakable resemblance, those same blue eyes, the delicate shape of their faces, the calm way they observed him. There was no denying it anymore. These weren't just girls in need. They were his daughters. He crouched back down slowly, his voice barely above a whisper as he asked, "What are your names?" The one with the bear answered, "I'm Sophie." The other said, "I'm Lily. Our sister's name is Claire." Something inside Henry fractured. 3 daughters. Triplets. And he had known nothing. He had spent years expanding his empire, attending galas, dominating boardrooms, completely unaware that 3 lives had begun without him. Sophie reached into her small backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She handed it to him without explanation. Henry opened it and saw a crayon drawing, 3 girls holding hands with a smiling woman, and next to them, a tall man in a blue suit. In messy block letters, the caption read, "Our family one day." His throat tightened. He rose to his feet and walked to the nurse's station, barely registering the looks of surprise as he firmly asked for the files of Claire Brooks and Emily Brooks. After confirming his identity as the clinic owner, the staff complied quickly. The charts told him what the girls had not. Claire had suffered acute kidney failure brought on by an undiagnosed autoimmune condition. She had been brought in days ago. Her mother had collapsed shortly after from cardiac stress, most likely exhaustion and anxiety-induced. Emily had been listed as a single parent with no emergency contact. In the father's field, there was only a dash. That small line was suddenly more unbearable than anything he had seen in his business life. It was an erasure of his place in their story, and he had done it to himself. Returning to the bench, Henry found Sophie resting her head on Lily's shoulder. They looked small and impossibly brave. "How long have you been here?" he asked. 3 days, Lily replied. "They let us sleep in one of the waiting rooms. But mostly we stay out here. We didn't want to leave Claire alone." Henry sat beside them without hesitation. "You're not going to stay alone anymore," he said quietly. "I'm here now." They didn't respond right away. Sophie looked up at him, cautious but hopeful. "Does that mean, you believe us?" Henry nodded. "Yes. And I'm going to do everything I can to help your sister. And your mom." He placed his phone on silent, sent a brief message to his assistant, "Cancel everything for the week," and then looked back at the girls. "Let's go see if we can visit Claire together." The nurse on duty allowed a brief visit. The room was dimly lit, monitors beeping steadily, Claire lying motionless beneath white sheets, her face pale but peaceful. Lily held Henry's hand tightly as they walked in. Sophie placed her stuffed bear next to Claire on the bed and whispered, "I told you he'd come." Henry's chest ached. He stepped closer to the bed, not touching, just watching. There was so much he had missed, so much he had to make up for. But in that moment, none of it mattered more than staying right there, beside the girls who somehow still believed in him. And in the daughter he hadn't even known existed, until now. The next morning arrived quietly, with the soft shuffle of nurses changing shifts and the hum of machines echoing through the ICU. Henry hadn't left the hospital. He had spent the night in a stiff armchair just outside Claire's room, half asleep, his jacket draped over Sophie, who had curled up beside him sometime during the early hours. Lily was resting with her head on his shoulder, her small hand clutching his sleeve like an anchor. At sunrise, he stirred and looked at both girls, his body aching but his mind sharper than it had been in years. He didn't know how to be a father, not yet, but something in his bones told him he couldn't return to the life he had lived before, not now, not after this. After breakfast, which consisted of hospital coffee for him and a muffin split between the girls, Henry made a decision. He would not allow these children to drift through a system that had no place for them. He requested a private meeting with the hospital administrator, insisting it happen immediately. As the founder and majority owner of the clinic, his word carried weight, but for the first time, he was using that power for something deeply personal. In the meeting, he outlined what he needed: full access to Claire and Emily's treatment plans, legal clarity on guardianship status, and a pediatric specialist flown in from one of their top facilities. The administrator, though surprised by Henry's sudden involvement, agreed without hesitation. When Henry returned to the ICU, Emily's condition was still unchanged. Her body was stable but unresponsive. The doctors were hopeful that she could recover with time, but there were no guarantees. Claire remained under close observation, and while her condition was improving slightly, she had not yet regained consciousness. Henry sat between their rooms for most of the day, fielding updates from his assistant who had arrived with a folder full of information on Emily's life over the past several years. She had lived quietly and modestly, working night shifts as a nurse in small clinics, raising the girls without any support. She hadn't tried to contact him. She hadn't filed for child support or chased him through lawyers. Instead, she had protected her daughters the only way she knew how, by keeping them safe in her own orbit. The report included something that made Henry's breath catch. One of the clinics Emily had worked at had been one of his. She had been in his orbit all along. A nurse under a different last name, Brooks was her maiden name. She had been close, and he had never noticed. That realization stayed with him like a stone in his chest. He could have found them years ago. Instead, they had found him. That evening, while the girls played with a donated coloring book in the waiting room, Henry stepped outside for air. He didn't go far, just to the garden terrace at the end of the corridor. The sky was beginning to turn orange, streaked with clouds and the promise of another long night. For the first time in a long time, he felt uncertain about everything. He was used to making calculated decisions, building structures, controlling variables. But none of that had prepared him for the weight of fatherhood crashing down in a single day. He took out his phone and called Dana, his longtime assistant. She answered on the first ring. "I need a family law attorney. Someone discreet and fast. And I want background checks done on every caregiver Emily and the girls ever interacted with. No one failed them, but I need to make sure of that myself." Dana paused, then asked gently, "What's the plan, Henry?" He looked through the glass at the two girls waiting for him. "The plan is, I'm not walking away again. That's the only plan that matters." As he hung up and returned to the hallway, Sophie saw him first and ran to meet him with a shy smile. Lily followed, slipping her hand into his without a word. He didn't need them to call him Dad yet. He didn't even need them to understand everything that was happening. He just needed them to know they weren't alone anymore. And he would prove that to them one day at a time. The fourth day began in the same hospital corridor, but something had changed. The girls no longer sat with their shoulders hunched and eyes glued to the ICU door. They had started to trust that someone was staying with them, someone they didn't have to remind or beg not to leave. Henry had returned early that morning with a small paper bag in his hand. Inside were 2 new pairs of socks, a set of clean pajamas, and a pack of crayons. He handed it to Lily and Sophie without much explanation, simply saying, "You might be more comfortable like this." The girls lit up, and for a moment, the hospital didn't feel quite so heavy. Later, he arranged for a nurse to bring them to one of the quiet family lounges upstairs, where they could nap on couches and watch cartoons while still being nearby. He stayed close, checking in between conference calls that he conducted with his phone pressed to his ear and one eye always watching the girls. His business life continued in small fragments, a deal approved, a board member reassured, but it no longer took center stage. Every decision now orbited the hospital, and more specifically, the 3 girls who had unexpectedly become the core of his universe. By late afternoon, there was a new development. Claire had moved slightly in her bed. A hand twitched, a change in brainwave activity signaled light progress. The doctors were cautious but encouraged. Henry stood beside the bed, not speaking, just holding the small hand of the girl who looked so much like her sister's. She was still unconscious, but the slight squeeze of her fingers around his own left him breathless. He didn't cry, but the room felt warmer somehow. She was fighting. And she knew someone was there. Back in the lounge, Henry sat with Lily and Sophie and showed them how to play a simple card game. The girls explained that their mother used to play it with them after dinner, always letting them win. They smiled when they talked about her, but there was an ache under the laughter, a fragile thread holding it together. Henry listened carefully, not correcting or leading the conversation. He wanted to learn who their mother had been through their stories, not just the woman he once knew, but the woman they depended on every day. That evening, he stepped into Emily's room for the first time since arriving at the hospital. Machines beeped quietly beside her, and her face, though pale and still, held the same gentle strength he remembered. He pulled the chair close to her bed and sat down. For a few minutes, he said nothing, just watched her chest rise and fall in even rhythms. Finally, in a low voice, he spoke. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I need you to know I'm here. I should have been here sooner. I missed everything, and I know that's on me. But I'm going to fix it. Not with words, not with money. With time. With presence. With every single day from now on." Outside, Lily and Sophie waited with a nurse, quietly holding hands. Henry rejoined them a few minutes later and helped them settle in for the night in the hospital's private guest room, which he'd requested be prepared just for them. They took turns brushing their teeth, then climbed under a donated blanket and fell asleep quickly. He sat in the chair between their small beds, watching the rise and fall of their breathing. As the building quieted around him, he realized something that surprised him. He didn't want to leave. Not just the hospital, not just that room, he didn't want to leave this life that had so abruptly taken hold of him. It was unfamiliar, unscheduled, and more chaotic than anything he'd known. But it felt true. He had stepped out of his world of certainty and stepped into something raw and deeply human. And somehow, in the middle of it all, he had found the one thing he didn't even know he'd been searching for: belonging. The fifth day began with a gentle knock on the door of the hospital guest room. A nurse entered quietly with a tray of breakfast, placing it on the small table near the window. Henry was already awake, having spent most of the night half-sitting in the armchair between the girls' beds, checking hospital updates on his tablet and sending brief replies to messages piling up from his executive team. But for the first time in his career, those messages no longer held the same urgency. He looked over at Lily and Sophie, both still asleep, arms draped across their pillows, faces peaceful in the early morning light. He stood, stretched silently, and whispered to the nurse that he'd take the girls down to the cafeteria later. He didn't want to wake them yet. Let them rest. Later that morning, Henry was summoned to the administrative office. Grace, a social services representative, had arrived. She was kind but professional, her eyes sharp as she asked questions about his relationship to the children and their mother. Henry answered honestly, even when the truth embarrassed him. He admitted he hadn't known about the girls until days ago. He explained how he found them, how they had recognized him from something their mother once said, how he had stayed with them since. Grace listened without judgment, though she made notes continuously. At one point she looked up and asked, "Do you intend to stay involved?" Henry met her eyes without hesitation. "I already am. I intend to become their guardian. And not just legally, I want to be their father, in every way." Grace explained the necessary steps. A background check, home evaluation, psychological assessment, and interviews with the children once they felt secure. Henry agreed to it all. He even offered to move his schedule to accommodate anything needed. Before she left, Grace said something that stuck with him. "It's rare to see someone this successful put everything on pause for children they just met. But you don't act like you just met them. You act like they've always been yours." Henry didn't reply, but her words stayed with him the rest of the day. Back in the ICU, Claire's vitals had improved slightly. The doctors remained cautious but said the signs were good. Lily and Sophie were allowed a brief visit again, and they held their sister's hands, whispered to her, and told her stories about their time with Dad so far. Hearing them call him that sent a pulse of warmth through Henry that he couldn't explain. He hadn't asked them to call him anything. It had just happened, naturally, like the bond forming between them was bigger than names or definitions. That afternoon, Henry had the hospital arrange a video call with a child trauma counselor from one of his other clinics. He wanted the girls to have someone to talk to besides him, someone trained to help them navigate the confusion and emotional weight they were carrying. During the session, he stepped out into the hallway and made a call to his real estate attorney. By evening, a plan was in motion to have Emily and the girls moved into his penthouse temporarily once they were discharged, with renovations underway to prepare a more child-friendly space in his home. Everything was happening fast, but none of it felt rushed. It felt necessary. That night, while helping the girls settle in again, Sophie asked if he would still visit them once they left the hospital. Henry looked at her and said, "I'm not visiting. I'm staying. Wherever you are, that's where I'll be." Lily crawled across her bed and hugged him tightly. "Promise?" she asked. He didn't hesitate. "Promise." When the lights were turned down and the girls were fast asleep, Henry stood at the window overlooking the city skyline. His reflection looked unfamiliar, not in appearance, but in presence. He had spent his entire life chasing control, excellence, wealth. Now, everything that truly mattered was sleeping in two small beds behind him. And for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The sixth day brought with it a sense of rhythm that hadn't existed before. What had begun as chaos and emotional upheaval was slowly transforming into something steady, even comforting. Henry arrived early at the hospital as usual, carrying two small gift bags, each containing a new storybook, a set of markers, and a small snack. He had stopped by a bookstore just after sunrise. Not because he had to. Because he wanted the girls to wake up to something more than hospital walls and the weight of waiting. He found Lily already up, sitting on the edge of her bed, quietly petting a stuffed animal nurse had found for her the night before. Sophie was still curled beneath her blanket, but as soon as she saw him, she smiled and reached for one of the bags without hesitation. After breakfast, the doctors reported more good news. Claire's vitals had strengthened, and her sedation would be reduced later that day. If everything continued in this direction, she could wake up soon. The girls were cautiously hopeful. They asked dozens of questions about what waking up would feel like, if Claire would remember them, and if she would be scared. Henry answered everything as gently as he could, being honest without promising more than the doctors could give. Then, when Sophie asked if their mother was going to wake up too, Henry knelt beside her and said, "She's fighting, just like Claire. We're all fighting with her." It wasn't a guarantee, but it was the truth, and it mattered. Later that morning, Grace returned to follow up on Henry's guardianship application. She met with Lily and Sophie privately while Henry waited in the hallway, pacing slowly, trying not to overthink every sound from the room. When Grace came out, she gave him a calm nod. "They trust you," she said. "That doesn't come easy for children who've been through this much." Henry thanked her and then walked back inside, where the girls were now sitting side by side, drawing. When he asked what they talked about, Lily just smiled and said, "We told her about your pancakes. You make good ones." That afternoon, something shifted again. Claire moved her hand. Then her eyelids fluttered. The moment was brief, but it sent a wave of energy through the room. Nurses moved quickly, checking monitors and updating her chart. Henry held Lily and Sophie close as they watched through the window. They didn't fully understand what it meant yet, but they could feel the change. There was movement. There was hope. Henry stayed close for the rest of the day, arranging for Claire to be moved to a more private recovery room when she regained consciousness. He called in a pediatric neurologist from one of his top clinics to assist. Everything was handled with precision, but not out of habit. This time, it came from emotion. He wasn't just managing resources. He was protecting his child. That evening, as they walked down to the hospital garden together, Lily picked a tiny wildflower growing between the stones and handed it to him. "For your office," she said, not knowing that he hadn't stepped foot in that office since the day he met them. He took it anyway, placing it carefully in his coat pocket. Sophie skipped ahead, laughing when one of the garden lights flickered and called it magic. For a moment, they were just children in a world not ruled by hospital schedules or machines. And for the first time, Henry laughed with them, not politely, not distractedly, but fully, letting the sound break through years of silence he hadn't realized he was living in. That night, as he tucked the girls in, Sophie asked if she could write a letter to Claire for when she woke up. Lily wanted to draw a picture instead. Henry gave them both paper and waited as they created small messages for their sister, filled with hearts, stick figures, and crooked words full of love. When they were done, they asked if he would hold on to them and make sure Claire got them first. He promised. And when he stood at the foot of their beds, watching them drift off to sleep, he realized he had already begun to change, not out of guilt or obligation, but out of love. A love he hadn't known was in him. A love he never wanted to let go. On the 7th day, the hospital hallway outside Claire's room felt different. The energy was no longer heavy with worry, it buzzed instead with quiet anticipation. Henry had barely slept, though he'd been offered a suite in a nearby hotel to rest. He refused. He couldn't bring himself to be anywhere else. Something deep inside him insisted he stay close, as if his presence alone might tip the balance in Claire's favor. That morning, the doctors informed him that the sedation had been fully withdrawn and Claire's body was responding well. It was only a matter of time. He gathered Lily and Sophie before breakfast and told them as gently as he could. Claire might open her eyes today. The words made Sophie's hand tremble as she held her juice box, while Lily stared at him with a mix of excitement and fear. "Will she remember us?" she asked. Henry smiled and replied, "If she's anything like you two, she'll remember everything." They spent the morning preparing. Henry brought in a framed photo of all three girls from the drawing Sophie had given him earlier and placed it near Claire's bedside. He brought their letters and tucked them under her pillow. Lily decorated a paper heart with sparkles and carefully taped it to the wall. Nurses walked in and out, giving gentle smiles, adjusting wires and settings, quietly acknowledging that the day felt significant. Just after noon, it happened. Claire stirred more noticeably than before. Her fingers twitched again, her head shifted slightly, and then her eyelids flickered open. Her gaze didn't focus immediately, but when it did, it landed on Henry. He was standing quietly at the side of her bed, afraid to breathe. Slowly, her mouth opened, and a hoarse whisper escaped. "Daddy?" The word shattered something in him. He hadn't expected that. She had never met him, had no way of knowing who he was in any real sense. But she knew. Somehow, she knew. Henry leaned in, brushing her hair back gently and said, "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm right here." Nurses came in to assess her status, asking her questions to test reflexes and awareness. Claire answered in broken whispers, each word stronger than the last. Lily and Sophie were allowed in soon after. The moment Claire saw them, her face lit up with a weak but unmistakable smile. Lily ran to her side, hugging her gently, and Sophie clutched Claire's hand so tightly it turned red. "We missed you," Sophie whispered. Claire didn't cry. She just nodded and squeezed their hands in return. Later that day, when things settled, Henry sat alone in the hospital garden, processing what had just happened. His phone buzzed constantly, calls from investors, messages from executives, calendar alerts for meetings he'd long since ignored. He turned it off. There was nothing in that world that could compare to what he had just seen in that room. He had watched his daughter come back to life, had heard her call him Daddy without hesitation, without doubt. It wasn't about blood. It was about presence. About love given and love received, even in silence. That evening, Henry met with Grace again. He updated her on Claire's recovery and asked how soon he could move forward with formal custody. Grace told him things were moving faster than expected. The background checks had cleared, his home had been preliminarily approved, and the girls had expressed consistent desire to stay with him. All that remained was the court hearing. Henry offered to fly in a private evaluator if it would help speed the process. Grace just smiled and said, "You're already doing the hardest part, showing up." When Henry tucked the girls into bed that night, they asked if Claire could come home soon. He promised she would, and that when she did, everything would be ready. As he turned off the lights, Sophie asked him if he had been scared today. He paused in the doorway and said, "Yes. But I was more proud than scared." Lily added, "Because you're our dad now, right?" Henry stepped back in and kissed them both on the forehead. "Yes. I'm your dad. And I always will be." As they drifted off to sleep, Henry sat by the window again, only this time he didn't feel lost. He felt full. The skyline outside no longer looked like his kingdom. It looked like the backdrop to a life that was finally real. The 8th day started with sunshine pouring through the hospital windows, casting golden light across the tiled floors. Henry stood by the window in Claire's recovery room, sipping coffee that had long gone cold. Claire was sleeping peacefully, her chest rising and falling in a slow, steady rhythm. She had spoken more the night before, recognizing both her sisters and even asking where their mom was. Henry had answered gently, explaining that Emily was still resting but would wake up soon. Claire had nodded and said, "I'll wait for her," before drifting back to sleep. That morning felt different from the others. There was no immediate fear, no cloud of crisis looming overhead. Instead, there was hope. Doctors entered the room not with warnings or guarded language, but with smiles and calm updates. Claire's vitals were stable, her kidney function had improved, and the first stages of recovery were officially underway. The head nurse leaned over to Henry and whispered, "She's strong. Just like her sisters." Henry looked at Claire and replied quietly, "Like her mother." Later, as Claire napped, Henry took Lily and Sophie down to the hospital garden. He had arranged for a small picnic on the lawn, something ordinary, something joyful. They sat on a blanket under the shade of a tree, drinking juice and eating peanut butter sandwiches. Sophie shared her chips with a bird that hopped nearby, and Lily leaned against Henry's shoulder with a kind of ease that melted him. He realized that their bond wasn't new anymore. It had roots now. It was real, and it had depth. The girls weren't just surviving, they were beginning to live again. After lunch, Grace arrived at the hospital with a small folder in her hands. She greeted the girls with a warm smile, then pulled Henry aside. In the hallway, she handed him the folder and said, "The court has fast-tracked your guardianship petition. The judge reviewed your case last night. You've been granted emergency custody." Henry stared at the papers for a long moment, then looked up at Grace. "So they're really mine?" She nodded. "They always were. Now it's just official." Back in Claire's room, he told her first. She looked at him with tired but curious eyes and asked, "Does that mean we go home now?" Henry smiled and replied, "Soon. And it'll be our home now." She reached out and took his hand without hesitation. Later that evening, Henry sat with Emily for a while, even though she was still unconscious. He told her about Claire waking up, about the girls laughing in the garden, about the court's decision. He said, "They miss you. I miss you. And when you're ready, we'll be here. All of us." He kissed her forehead and sat in silence, letting his words fill the space between them. By the end of the day, he brought the girls to see the furnished apartment across the street from the hospital. It was a temporary space, warm and sunlit, with enough room for everyone. The girls ran from room to room, picking beds, arguing over curtain colors, and pretending the couch was a pirate ship. Henry stood in the doorway and watched them with quiet awe. This wasn't what he'd planned for his life. But it was better. As night fell and the girls curled up on the couch with popcorn and a movie, Henry sat behind them, absorbing every detail. Their small heads leaning together, the way they laughed at the same moments, how they looked back at him from time to time just to make sure he was still there. He was. And he would be. Long after they had fallen asleep, Henry stepped out onto the balcony and looked out over the city. The skyline still glittered with everything he'd once thought he wanted: power, recognition, control. But inside the apartment were the only things that mattered now. The life he was building no longer fit into spreadsheets or quarterly reports. It was measured in drawings taped to the wall, whispers before bed, and the weight of a small hand trusting his without fear. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time, he welcomed it. Not with strategy, but with heart. He was no longer a man defined by what he owned. He was a father. And that made him whole. The ending of this story feels deeply earned, not because everything resolves perfectly, but because it reflects something more powerful: growth through presence. Henry's transformation is not sudden or melodramatic, it's quiet, steady, and grounded in small, human choices. The man who once measured life by contracts and deadlines comes to understand that true worth is found in connection, responsibility, and unconditional care. What makes this conclusion so moving is the simplicity of what it offers: a second chance. Not just for Henry, but for the girls who needed someone to stay, and for Emily, whose strength shaped them all. The story doesn't rely on grand gestures to prove love, it shows it through consistency, through showing up every day, even when it's hard, even when it's unfamiliar. For me, the most beautiful part is that Henry doesn't become a different person. He becomes a fuller one. The father he chooses to be isn't built on guilt or debt, it's built on love. That, more than any title or fortune, is what makes the ending unforgettable.